This video will deal with global business. A global industry can be defined as an industry in which firms must compete in all world markets for that product in order to survive. So firms must compete in all world markets for the product it's making in order for it to survive. So domestic markets are not big enough or are not capable of producing enough revenue to sustain the company. It must engage in sales overseas in other countries to try and make up a market sufficiently big to enable the industry to continue in existence. An industry in which a firm's competitive advantage depends on economies of scale and economies of scope gained across markets. Well, both economies of scale and economies of scope are the subject matter of other videos, but very briefly, economies of scale means economies due to size, so bigger companies may have lower average costs. That may come about because they're able to get advantages from bulk buying and advantageous borrowing terms from banks by virtue of their size. They're able to employ specialist workers and specialist machinery and so on. So their size gives them advantages. And the ideas of economies of scope would be their ability to perform certain functions and their capacity to meet challenges and deal with them. So globalized industry arises because sometimes companies are forced into looking for new markets overseas in order for them to sustain themselves, make enough revenue to continue. But also they may look for markets and the extension of markets because it will generate economies of scale and economies of scope, which will enable them to cut their costs and become more competitive. Global markets are international markets where products are largely standardized. It's generally the case that a company produces a product in one market, it becomes, let's say, successful, and therefore it is introduced, because of its success, it's introduced in other markets in the expectation that it will be equally successful. So global industry is trying to standardize across countries, between markets in other countries. So we have similar products for sale in different countries. And some people say that that's introducing a type of homogeneity into the economies of different countries. Economies are starting to look and feel the same. They're starting to have the same products and the same approach to marketing and so on. So it's as if global markets are impacting on culture, on the way people live, on city designs and so on. So it's becoming a more globalized world. According to Michael Porter, a famous writer, Porter's Five Forces, that crops up in many of the other videos, according to Michael Porter, industries are either multi-domestic or global. So we have a dichotomous relationship here. It's either multi-domestic or global. Global industries, well, competition is global for a start. The same firms compete with each other everywhere. So in one country we may have several companies competing for the customer's attention and for the customer's income, for sales in that economy. But you have the same set of firms, the same set of companies fighting it out in other countries as well, trying to get the custom in the other countries. So it's competition which is in the domestic market, but the same competition will exist in other markets because of the globalized nature of competition. Multi-domestic industries, well, firms compete in each national market independently of other national markets. So multi-domestic means the firms compete within, let's say, the home market, whatever that is. Let's say they compete within the home market, and they compete with each other, and that's independent of what they do in other markets, perhaps overseas. So it's multi-domestic. There are many companies in the domestic market that are competing and trying to survive. Sometimes we get the same companies operating in another market, which sounds like it's global, but they are pursuing different goals, different objectives. They have different orientations, different policies, different strategic policies perhaps. So in a sense they are different to what's happening domestically, and this makes them multi-domestic industries. They are concentrating their policies on a particular market, albeit they might have a presence in other markets, and they will concentrate on that particular market. Whereas globalized industries tend to be more, they have one set of policies. They're working on the organization, growing it into one large organization across national boundaries. Multi-domestic, in a sense, the companies keep their integrity. They remain independent, but they are competing in different markets. In general, businesses adopt a global strategy in global markets and a multi-local strategy in multi-domestic markets. So multi-local strategy means that the same company may operate in different parts of the domestic market. They may operate in different regions. They may operate in different segments of the market, indeed. So multi-local strategies in multi-domestic markets and global strategies in global markets. Now the global strategy, well, let's break it down into 8 points. I've grayed out the points on this slide, but here we could bear in mind a company, say for example like Sony, which would be a good illustration of what we're going to talk about. So just bear Sony in mind and we'll go through the points. We'll start with obviously enough, the first one, which means global strategies competing in many, if not all, countries. So the company has a presence in many countries. So it has a global strategy. The single strategy, it could be a single strategy covering the company, which just simply happens to be in different countries. So it competes in many countries. Understanding that success requires a presence in almost every part of the world. And because of the impact of globalization, companies have seen their average costs fall because it's cheaper to produce perhaps overseas. They see economies of scale, economies due to size, and also they have a much bigger market. So there's a lot of advantages from engaging in global production and global marketing. So when one company is seen to be performing well, others of course want to copy. So understanding that success requires a presence in almost every part of the world. And that's exactly what we see today. We see big companies operating in almost every country. Making the product the same for each market. Well, standardizing the product, of course, means a reduction in costs. The product is standardized. They'll have standardized production techniques, standardized processes, and the expertise for building or making the product will be well established within the organization. So there are advantages in making the same product for each market. Marketing advantages, production advantages, distribution advantages, personnel advantages. There are many advantages from making the same product for each market. There is a centralized control of the company. In globalized situations, generally speaking, there will be some center, there will be the base, the country that the company calls home. That will be the base, and that will tend to determine the policies pursued in different countries. Meeting customer needs and wants across international boundaries. Well, a global strategy must do that. It must attempt to meet customers' needs and wants. If it doesn't, it's not going to succeed. So it must aim at satisfying customers' needs and wants across international boundaries. Certainly if it's going to have a long-term presence in those markets. Locating their value-adding activities where they can achieve the greatest competitive advantage. Well, it's a question of looking at the overall production system. It could be parts of the item is produced in one country and moved to another country, and in fact the product may be made in several countries and perhaps assembled in a different country. But it's for the business to look at where their greatest strengths are. Where do they make the greatest savings? Where is the greatest expertise? Where is the greatest efficiency? And wherever that is, that could be the market that they are appealing to. So the other items come into that market for assembly and distribution around that system. So companies look at to see where they are most efficient, and then trying to locate that expertise and that advantage close to a large market. And that will give them, of course, a greater opportunity to achieve competitive advantage, to outcompete the rest. Integrating and coordinating activities across borders. The global strategy must enable this to happen. It must be the case that the company is able to help companies in branches, if you like, in other countries. It must be able to come to their rescue if they need it, or it must be able to supply expertise, or if there's an innovation, to spread the innovation to that other company. And so there must be integration and coordination of activities. It must work as one organization to be efficient. A global strategy is effective when differences between countries are small and competition is global. It may have the advantages of economies of scale. So global strategy is effective when differences between countries are small. If there are big differences between countries, then the company will have more problem in tweaking its operations to suit different countries, different cultures, different economic systems, different ways of working, different education systems. The companies will have to adjust quite radically to different countries. But if all the countries it enters are very similar, then of course it can reap the advantages of globalization easier. I'd say it may have the advantage of economies of scale. For example, lower costs. Economies of scale, as I said earlier, due to, for example, advantageous negotiating strength with the banks, trying to negotiate perhaps overdrafts or loans or some sort of source of finance. It will have an advantage if it's a big company. It'll have an advantage in recruiting and retaining workers. They like to work for big companies. And it'll have advantages in distribution, and perhaps it might have specialist machinery. It may have secured raw materials from a source that will only sell to the big company. So overall it may have lower costs. It may also, as I said, be able to coordinate activities. Because it's a large company, it's able to plan more effectively where products are made and where components are made and where they're assembled and what's the most efficient way of doing it. And there may be faster product development because there may be different perspectives of the product in different countries, different requirements by customers, different ideas about production. And that means there could be faster product development, more new ideas coming through. However, global strategies and the whole process of globalization has met with some criticism from some people, from sociologists perhaps, or from politicians, or just travellers and observers, that globalization in terms of production and the business and economic side of the development of globalized work and globalized trading has led to some sort of standardization across the world. It's the case that when we travel, if we go to various cities, we will see essentially the same shops. We will see many shops which are the same, and we will see outlets selling and retailing similar products. So there is a growing standardization across the world, and many people regret this. They think we're losing something. We're losing the diversity we had before, and the world was a more interesting place. Multi-domestic strategy. Well, this involves products tailored to individual countries. We think of products aimed at particular countries. For example, air conditioners are particularly suited to tropical countries. So the big industries in air conditioning, the big producers, normally are clustered in countries with very high temperatures and with a requirement for air conditioning. So it involves products tailored to individual countries. Multi-domestic strategy. Innovation comes from local research and development. The companies operate within particular markets and will rely on their own research and development teams to innovate the product. Of course, the innovations may be orientated towards the conditions in that country, which is the most logical thing to happen. And the R&D teams will be drawn from workers from that particular country, so they will know the requirements very well. So they're best suited to be based in local companies. There is decentralization of decision making within the organization. There can be various layers of decision making, in fact, with multi-domestic companies. It could be that the company, the originator, if you like, the company in the original country may still have a major say in the organization and may still influence strategy and policy and design and processes and marketing and so on. So it still may be dominated in that way. However, it could also be the case that it's got a greater degree of autonomy, but there is decentralization of decision making within the organization to reflect the types of expertise and the types of products and directions in which the company should be traveling, should be moving. And this leads to various layers of decentralization which may occur within these companies. Generally speaking, decentralization leads to local sourcing. When there is decentralization, it may mean that there is an expertise within the decentralized area, an expertise in terms of where sources are, the types of products, reliability, personal knowledge of markets and so on. So it means that local sourcing may be used. Of course, that can be a good thing because it's politically good. It's building up the power base of the company within that society. The government will see it as a major employer and a growing employer with growing importance. There could be a downside, of course, that the local sourcing may be more expensive than that available elsewhere, and perhaps the cheapest option is to make components in other countries and move them to one country for assembly. But that may meet with bad press and objections from the government. The disadvantage of serving local needs are high cost to tailored products, due to tailored products. When products have to be amended to meet local demand and local requirements, they are in a sense being tailored to that market. And the advantages of globalization was to have a standard product. Now, if the products have to be amended for local markets, some of the advantages of having the standard product will have been lost. The core of the product may remain the same, but its attributes, its design, its the whole nature of the product may have to be amended in some way to meet local requirements. So that militates against the advantages we talked about in terms of why globalization comes about. It may come about because there are perceived advantages due to standardization. Now standardization has been lost. It could be that there is duplication across countries. Sometimes companies produce an item, it becomes successful, and instead of looking for economies of scale in one center, the company reproduces itself in another country and starts making the same product, identical products, is duplicated. And that sounds like it's bad, and in a sense it is, because they've lost the advantages of economies of scale. However, there is one exception, that if the original company was operating at its minimum average cost, minimum long-run average cost, in other words, it was working with the most efficient plant at the most efficient level of output, then if the company tried to step up its production so it could export to subsidiaries in other countries, if it was to step up its output, then its long-run average cost would increase. So maybe the best policy is to have a country operating at peak efficiency, long-run efficiency, and not increase the output further, because any increase in output will lead to an increase in cost in that country, and then duplicate the plant in another country so that the other country will also experience falling costs and efficiencies. Like everything in economics, there's an argument against that as well, and that is, of course, it depends critically on the size of the markets. If the company is fortunate enough to have achieved its long-run efficiency with a certain market size, then it's lucky. It's lucky to have satisfied all the market at maximum efficiency. But then duplicating itself into another market doesn't mean it's going to have the same size of market, so there may be inefficiencies in the second plant in the other country. So it's just worth thinking about. There are issues associated with duplication. Comparison of the two strategies. Well, there are four drivers determine the extent and nature of globalization in an industry. The first set of drivers are the market drivers. Similarity in customer needs. Clearly, if the customers don't like the products, perhaps from one country the products are very popular, but in another country they're not liked, then there is no opportunity for producing overseas. There's no market, so there will not be globalization. So the most fundamental market driver is that the customer needs must be similar between production centers, between countries. There should be a global distribution network. There should be a way of enabling the companies to produce in other markets and distribute in other markets, and move personnel and equipment and expertise and components and so on from one country to another. There should be some sort of network that's facilitated. Now, this would have to be negotiated politically, and the infrastructure would have to be in place to enable it to happen. But if it wasn't in place, then the whole process of globalization could be very expensive indeed, and in fact it may deter the whole process. Transferable marketing. Well, whatever marketing skills have been picked up in one country related to the product, the chances are those skills could be used in other countries. At least some of the skills maybe. Perhaps there might be cultural differences which lead to some processes and some ways of marketing not to be adopted in other countries because they militate against cultural requirements. But there could be transferable marketing initiatives. And it could also be the case, of course, that what the company has found in the original country related to the product from its market research, that could also be true in the other country. It's a question really of trying to match the two sets of experiences to see what works. The second set of drivers are the cost drivers. Well, the potential for economies of scale, as I said before. Economies due to size, due to the advantages of bigger operations. When markets are big, companies tend to get big and their long-run average costs may decline. At some stage, of course, the companies may get too big, so that they're actually difficult to control, difficult to coordinate, and costs will rise because there's a breakdown in management. They're not able to effectively control the business. So there are diseconomies of size, diseconomies of scale, after certain levels of output have been reached. Another cost driver would be low transportation costs. Transportation costs have fallen. With the globalized world in which we live, there have been enormous developments in freight transportation and in container transportation. Ports have been adopted. We see bigger ships, and so transportation costs, generally speaking, have fallen, and that will encourage globalization. Product development costs may also be an issue. Sometimes companies are able to develop a product in one country. The cost of developing it may be significant, and perhaps the market in that country will just about cover the costs of development and the cost of research and development and so on. But if the product can then be planted into another country and sold effectively there, then of course the product development cost has already been covered. So it's selling more units and covering the product development cost by more units being sold. Economies of scope. Well, I mentioned right at the outset, this is a topic that really needs to be looked at in a separate video, but for the moment, companies need to have the capacity to be able to develop effective working practices and connect these working practices into some sort of coherent production system. And that means across national boundaries there may be issues associated with being able to plant good working techniques from one place to the next. But if the company can do it, then they've got the scope to grow, the scope to achieve greater market penetration and greater involvement in markets within that country. So it's a question of having the ability to exploit whatever opportunities there are. A topic that needs to be looked at more fully in a full video. Government drivers, that's the third type. Trade policies and market liberalization. Governments need to liberalize markets if they're going to engage in globalized practices and allow their companies to become globalized. So they must be able to have liberal markets, for example. Markets should be allowed to work effectively, and there should be very few obstacles to international trade in the form of restrictions on trade, tariff barriers or quotas on imports. Generally speaking, these are being lifted anyway through negotiations through the World Trade Organization. But nonetheless, it's important that these are removed, so there's greater market liberalization both within the economy and between economies to enable companies to trade effectively between international centres. Compatible technical standards and common marketing regulations. It should be the case that the companies are able to translate the technical requirements for the product's production into standards that are understood in the other country. This may be quite simple, moving from metric to imperial or imperial to metric. But it may also be particular requirements for the production of a certain item, that it's produced in a certain way, and the technical standards required for the production of it need to be set out and understood and essentially performed in the same way in the two centres. Because the domestic one, the one where that is doing the globalizing, in that centre they have worked out best practice. So it's exporting best practice in terms of technical standards and how to produce the item. There may also be common marketing regulations for the product. There may be greater understanding of the marketing requirements for the product, and these could be made known to the other country so that they are not starting from scratch. They're not learning from the start. They are building on the experiences of the other organization. Privatization is also a good indicator of the way governments think about the market economy. If the government is nationalizing railways or nationalizing coal production or steel production or whatever it is, it sends a signal that other countries may do the same. And if other countries do it, then that's the end of globalization. The investors are not going to put large sums of money into another country in the form of investment expenditure if they fear that the government in that country will nationalize their investments, because they will get nothing back. So they are looking to governments to have policies of privatization. In other words, flagging up that they're not just interested in the market, but they want to move the state back and advance the market. There are also competitive drivers. Domestic competition may force globalization. It could be the case that companies face fierce competition domestically, and in order to survive they have to go overseas to see if they can sell overseas to enable them to continue in existence. So these are some of the issues associated with global business that are worth bearing in mind. It's important that you go back over the notes, make your own, and make a list of points for and against and so on, and do some research, do some reading on the topic as well, and pad out your notes accordingly. But that's all we're going to deal with in this talk, so we're going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.